Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch review, and today we're going to take a look at the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Extra Thin. The specific reference of the one we're taking a look at is the newer style, or the current reference, which is the 15202 ST. As with all my reviews, let's go back in time and look at the history of this watch. If we go back now to 1969, which is when Seiko released the world's first quartz watch. Before then, all watches were mechanical movement, and it immediately became incredibly popular. Those next couple of years saw a really huge boom in terms of the movement towards quartz. People started to buy quartz watches over mechanical watches because they were much cheaper firstly, but also they're extremely accurate. And what happened as a result of that is the Swiss watch industry saw a massive hit in sales. They really struggled, a lot of the brands went bust. And it really killed the industry. In the early 70s, Audemars Piguet was one of the many houses or watchmaking houses that saw a huge hit on sales. And they knew they had to do something and take the market by storm with something completely new and completely different in order to save the brand. So in 1971, just before Basel Fair 1971, they contacted a famous watch designer called Gerald Genta. And they said to him, we need you to design something totally new, totally different. Sports watches were very popular around that time, especially steel sports watches. And so they said to Gerald Genta, we need you to design a steel sports watch, but we want it to be finished to the same level, if not greater than, all the dress watches available. We basically want this watch to be everyone's only watch, as in it was a possibility for the client that purchased this watch to be able to just have this watch in their collection and it be perfect for any occasion, whether it be a sporty, just t-shirt and shorts, or wearing a suit. So he knew he had to create something pretty special because nothing at that time was able to achieve that to the same level as what they wanted or what they envisaged. And in fact, Gerald Genta designed this watch, the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, overnight. He designed the watch, did drawings of the watch, but it took them around about a year to actually craft that watch and make that watch and make prototypes before they could release it at Basel Fair 1972. The original Royal Oaks were made in 18 karat white gold. Even though they wanted the watch to be in steel, it was just too difficult for them to machine that watch in steel and create the finishing they wanted to for that watch at that time. So most of the prototypes were in white gold, and it wasn't until later on that they actually produced the watch in steel. So Gerald Genta actually got inspiration for the design of the Royal Oak from an old diving helmet. And you can kind of see this design, the exposed or elevated bezel on the watch looks really similar to a diving helmet. The visible screws or bolts around the bezel, which looks very similar to the bolts in front of a diver's helmet around the glass. And also the exposed rubber gasket around the edge of the bezel was also similar to a diving helmet as well, the watertight seal. And the name Royal Oak came from a series of 8 British naval ships. And that's why, or partly why, he added 8 sides to the bezel, so octagonal bezel. The movement they used in the first Royal Oak was the 2121, the caliber 2121. And in fact, Audemars Piguet still uses this exact same movement today for their Royal Oak extra thin watches. The movement was made by Jaeger-LeCoultre, and a few other brands helped or assisted in creating this movement. It was a project that they had to create an extremely thin movement. It was to feature a date function and just hour and minutes hand, no seconds hand. It was just meant to be a really nice, simple movement, but ultra thin. So Jaeger were involved, Audemars Piguet were involved, and Patek Phillipe were involved. And they all kind of helped each other create this movement so that they could all use it for their own watches. And now that movement is used, or back then was used as well, in some very important watches in industry. One that's very notable is an important competitor of the Royal Oak, which is the Patek Philippe Nautilus. When the watch was released, the retail price was around 3,500 Swiss francs, which was considerably more than any other steel sports watch in the industry. And that really put people off when they saw the price of the watch. They just couldn't justify that. To put it in perspective, it was actually around 10 times more expensive than the most popular sports watch at that time, which was the Rolex Submariner. So that would, if we were to compare that to modern day times now, that would make that steel time and date watch, very simple watch, the Royal Oak, an equivalent of a retail price of £65,500 today if it was released today versus the Submariner, which is obviously crazy money for a steel watch. So for that reason, the watch wasn't very popular at first. People just didn't understand why on earth you'd want to spend that sort of crazy money on a watch, especially when it's steel and a sports watch. Audemars Piguet first made 1,000 watches. They did a run of 1,000 watches, and they wanted to sell those first and then start producing the watch in a little bit more mass or higher volume. And it took them around about a year to sell those first 1,000 watches. And after that, it became a really popular watch. People really recognized how incredible it was. And people realized that even though that sort of money would usually get you a very, very nice precious metal watch, the value in this Royal Oak in steel came from really the craftsmanship, and that's what made it precious, that it was so difficult to create that watch in steel and to that level of finishing that in itself made the watch precious. And people started to come around to that and realize that actually this was an incredibly special timepiece, and something you can't really get with a quartz watch is that same feeling and that same respect of craftsmanship and a level of attention to detail and care that's gone into creating a timepiece. Now skip 40 years on to 2012, and that was obviously the 40th anniversary of the Royal Oak, and Audemars Piguet, to celebrate that special day, they released a new reference, the 15202 ST, which is what we're looking at here today. But between 1972 and 2012, there were various new iterations of the extra thin, or back then they called it the ultra thin or the jumbo Royal Oak. They changed the design a few times over. But this reference 202 ST, released in 2012, was the truest to the original reference 5402 ST back from 1972. So for most people nowadays, this is a really special watch to have and that's why it's so popular as well. And why it fetches such a premium is because it really is the truest to the original design. The new reference 202 is not totally identical to the reference 5402 from 1972. There's a couple little changes they made to this watch, but the movement has stayed the same. They have changed a little feature in there where you can adjust the date a little bit more easily. But the watch has also become a little bit thicker since then, which is really due to the fact that they've now put a clear crystal case back on the back of the watch, so you can see straight through to the movement, whereas the original Royal Oak featured a steel case back, which allowed them to make it even thinner. Various other improvements have been made to the watch that make it a little bit more up to date with modern times now. But overall, this is definitely the truest modern day variation of the original 1972 Royal Oak. Okay, so that concludes the history on this Royal Oak. Now let's go and look at some of the features of this watch. So we're going to start with the clasp as usual. This Audemars Piguet clasp is definitely the best in the industry, I'd say. I absolutely love this clasp. It's incredibly solid. It's beautifully machined, wonderfully engineered. It's incredibly solid. It doesn't ever come off or ping off, especially this newer style clasp with the twin trigger. It's very, very solid. Yeah, you can't fault it. I love the fact it's low profile as well. It doesn't stick up over the bracelet like some of the Rolex ones and other brands. It doesn't break up the design of the incredible bracelet. It's just very seamless and perfect. I like the fact it has the AP logo square at the bottom. It's beautifully engineered, and they've really thought about how they can make this to sort of blend into the whole watch design. Now moving on to the bracelet. If you have watched any of my videos, then you'll know that I absolutely love the Audemars Piguet bracelet. I would say it's without question the best in the industry. It's truly special. It's just a magical bracelet, complete work of art. There's so many sort of little edges and facets on this bracelet. The polished and beveled edges along the edges of the bracelet. We've also got inside each link is polished. Everything is brushed on top. Just the attention to detail and the craftsmanship that goes into creating this incredible bracelet is just amazing. It's amazing to think this is finished pretty much by hand as well. We have this really elegant taper to the bracelet that tapers up really nicely to the case. And the same design, all the different edges, polished edges and brushed edges that we see on the bracelet is continued up onto the case of the watch. The small links, the tiny little links on this bracelet mean that it conforms to your wrist really nicely as well. It's a very comfortable bracelet. And the fact they're all flat and lots of tiny little links means that it scintillates and sparkles just like a diamond does, because the light shines off each flat edge individually, and as you move it through the light, it basically reflects the light off each flat surface individually rather than just a whole general sheen like you get on most bracelets. So it's an incredibly special bracelet. If you get to see it in real life, you understand how incredibly magical it is. But it's difficult to portray it on film fully. Something you really have to see in person. So moving now up onto the case, we have these two plots at the top of the case that connect the bracelet to the case. Again, like I said, the incredible polished edges and brushed edges are continued into the case seamlessly and perfectly. Everything complements each other perfectly on this watch. It's just a really beautiful design. The case is pretty much all brushed. We have a couple little accents or little polished accents across the case and on the crown. We've got a non-screw down crown. It's just a push-in crown, so there's no sort of stages to pulling it out and winding it. You just wind it while it's there in this present position, and then pulling it out allows you to change the time. So it's not as difficult to undo and change the time as like a normal Rolex that has a screw down crown. It's a little bit easier with this watch. Because of that, you don't have the same water resistance that you do on some other watches. Now moving up onto the bezel, we've got the exposed rubber gasket that I talked about earlier on, where Gerald Genta got his design from the diving helmet. So that's the accent there that we can see, the exposed rubber gasket. And then just above that, we have a brushed little edge around the edge of the bezel. And then above that, we have the beginnings of our octagonal accents, and that's a full polished effect. And then on the top we have a brushed finish, and then on top of the bezel we can also see our 8 hexagonal screws. And each one of these screws is made in 18 karat white gold, and that is a nod to the original Rolex that was designed, or the original prototypes that were designed and were crafted in white gold before they were made in steel. Something I love about the bezel on this watch is it's quite a flat bezel. The angle is very shallow, I suppose you could say, versus the other Rolex a little bit more steeper on the bezel. So because it's quite a flat watch, it has to have quite a much more of a shallow bezel. And I really like that because it means when you look down at the watch from above, you see much more of the polished edge, and that gives it a little bit more of a dressy, sort of, I don't know, more refined look to the watch. It looks a bit more special than some of the other Royal Oaks. It looks a little bit more like jewellery in that sense. Coming up now onto the dial, we have this amazing petite P3 dial, and Audemars Piguet uses the same very old machine to create this dial. It's all done by an old analog machine that kind of has a much larger pattern, or a patisserie dial. That is really large, and a needle goes over that and it moves an arm basically that then replicates that same pattern on a much smaller scale. On this watch we see a beautiful blue dial, just like the original Rolex that was released in 1972. This is my favourite variation of the Rolex Extra Thin or Jumbo. I love this blue dial. It's so nice and clean and elegant. One of my favourite variations though of the Extra Thin is the platinum one that Audemars Piguet recently released, that has like a darker outside to the dial and fades into a much lighter centre, kind of similar to how Patek Phillipe does it with some of their watches. That's a pretty special dial, but this is a really nice clean dial as well. Much more simple looking, this piece, than that one. We've got 18 karat white gold markers and logo and hands on this watch, and we have a same coloured date window as well. Okay, now we turn over the watch and we see the caliber 2121 that I discussed, that's designed by Jaeger and also Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe. This is an incredible movement, it's beautiful, and it's the exact same movement that they used in the original watch back in 1972. So I love that Audemars Piguet has kept it the same since then, kept it true to the original design. So for those purists, which really this watch is for, the clientele that buying the Extra Thin really are purists. They want the original and the most pure version of the Royal Oak. And you can't get more pure than this. And we've got this gorgeous rose gold rotor. It's kind of skeletonized a little bit like the perpetual calendar that I reviewed the other week. It's a really cool design, and you can actually have these customized as well by Audemars Piguet. The movement is just amazing looking. To think that it's that thin is just totally incredible. And the fact it's all handcrafted is even more amazing. Something that's slightly irritating about this watch is to change the date, you have to cycle through the hours. There's no sort of designated area on the crown that you can pull out to and then cycle through the dates quickly. So basically Audemars Piguet have given you like a middle ground to help you out. All you do is you advance the watch or advance the time to 12 midnight, so the date flicks over, and then you retreat the time back to around 10 o'clock, and then you can take it forward again past midnight, and that's kind of like a hack to basically change the time. This can be a little bit tedious. It's definitely less tedious than very old dress watches that just mean you have to cycle through the days, full 24 hours to change the date. But yeah, it's good to have that feature there, I suppose. Okay, so overall, would I own this watch? Of course I would own this watch. It's probably the best Audemars Piguet out there. It's the truest and it's the most important Audemars Piguet. If it wasn't for the Royal Oak, Audemars Piguet may not be here now. So yeah, it's an incredibly important watch for them. They are totally reliant on the Royal Oak line now. If it wasn't for the Royal Oak line, like I said, they wouldn't be here. So yeah, very special watch. This is the ultimate Royal Oak, which makes it possibly the ultimate Audemars Piguet. I love this newer reference, the 202. Not that it's very new now, 6 years old now, but it's definitely the best variation they've done since the original one. It's my favorite one, and I think it's the best looking watch as well. If you're a purist and you appreciate incredible craftsmanship, incredible finishing, then you can't get any better than this watch. This watch is now selling for considerably over its retail price. It's moving in line with the 5711 and starting to follow that price-wise. But I don't blame it. I think really for me, this is probably my favorite steel sports watch out there. I think it's an incredibly special piece. It looks incredible on your wrists. At 39mm, this is the perfect size for me. I cannot floor this watch. Yeah, it's perfect. I'm a massive Audemars Piguet fan, so I'm sure it's not very surprising that I like this watch. But yeah, it's definitely a special piece. Some people may find this watch a little bit too thin or a bit too small, but actually because the watch is just classic and a little bit more of a classic style watch, you kind of get used to it after a while. Very quickly you start to fall in love with this size and shape of the watch and the depth. We're so used to very big watches nowadays and very deep watches because that's the general style of watches now, but this is just such a special piece. When you wear this watch, it just feels incredibly magical, incredibly unique, and it has an amazing energy about it that it's very hard to describe and display on video. You really have to see this watch in person to understand how special a piece it is. Thanks guys for watching, and as always, if you're interested in this watch or any other watches in the Swiss watch industry, then don't hesitate to contact us. We can always call this watch into stock for you, and we can give you a quote for how long and how much it will be. Just contact us using the details in the description or at the end of this video, and we'd be happy to help.